Imagine you owe uh, so much money that even if you paid off $1 million every single day since the birth of Jesus Christ, you wouldn't even dent 2% of your total debt.
Which is, I mean, that math doesn't even sound right when you hear it out loud, right?
No, it sounds like a bad joke.
Yeah.
But, that is not a hypothetical. That is the exact mathematical reality of the United States government as of this morning.
Yeah. And when you combine that staggering financial reality with a sudden flurry of just like aggressive, sweeping executive actions happening across almost every sector of the economy.
Right. You get the chaotic 48-hour news cycle we are currently living through.
Exactly. We are essentially watching a real-time attempt to force these wildly complex global systems to, just bend to immediate political will.
So welcome to this deep dive. Today, we are staring down a massive stack of source material. We've got social media posts, news clips, official government statements, and all of this is entirely from August 21 and August 22, 2026.
Just the 2-day window, yeah.
It's just 2 days. So our mission here is to synthesize this massive news cycle. We want to cut through the noise, examine these executive actions in global trade, agriculture, the bond market, and the military, and figure out how they all mechanically connect to each other.
Because they do connect, even if it doesn't look like it at first glance.
Right. And more importantly, we are going to trace exactly how these maneuvers travel from a headline directly into your wallet.
Yeah, because we are dealing with some of the most complex livers of the global economy here.
Yeah.
It really requires looking past all the political theater to understand the actual, math and psychology driving these systems.
Okay, let's unpack this, but just a quick tone check before we jump in. Our sources today are filled with intense, hyper-partisan rhetoric from every side of the political spectrum.
Oh, absolutely. It's everywhere.
Yeah. So we just want to be clear. We are not here to endorse any of these viewpoints. We are simply here to lay out the facts impartially, analyze the source material provided, and help you understand the mechanics of what is actually happening.
Right. We're going to break down the how and the why behind the headline so you can make sense of it all yourself.
So let's start with the most immediate shock to the system. Something designed to hit the consumer economy almost instantly, which is this sudden, massive breakdown in international trade right on the U.S. border.
The northern border, specifically.
Right. The United States just abruptly slapped 50% tariffs on roughly $20 billion worth of Canadian goods. And we're talking everyday items here. Plywood, liquor, electrical equipment, and, yes, even hockey gear.
Yeah, the hockey gear is a wild detail. But I think the speed of this escalation is really what caught the markets off guard. Because, right before the collapse, these two sides were actually at the negotiating table discussing what looked like a solid compromise.
Wait, really? They were that close?
Yeah, they were. The discussions were centered around lowering tariffs on Canadian steel and aluminum to 25% and autos to 15%. But then the whole deal just vanished.
Wow. Okay, so U.S. Trade Representative Greer claimed that Canadian negotiators, quote unquote, upset the balance that they had worked out over days of talks.
Right, which prompted a huge reaction from Canada.
Yeah, the Canadian Prime Minister, Mark Carney, simply walked away. He explicitly said they would never sign a deal at any price. He ordered his negotiators back to Ottawa and announced a dollar-for-dollar retaliatory tariff set to kick in on September 8 just to protect Canadian workers.
And, the political fallout from this within the United States is just a fascinating display of bipartisan panic. You have state leaders across the political spectrum raising the alarm right now.
You really do. Looking at the reactions from Maine, Republican Senator Susan Collins and Democratic Governor Janet Mills are both sounding the alarm. Maine imports about $2 billion in non-petroleum products from Canada every year.
That's a massive hit for one state.
Exactly. Collins is pointing out that businesses, farmers, and lobstermen are terrified about navigating these sudden costs. And you see this echoed across basically all the border states.
Right, because their economies are so intertwined.
Yeah. Democratic Senator Amy Klobuchar noted that Canada is Minnesota's #1 trading partner. Senator Patty Murray said the exact same thing for Washington state, stating, "A tariff is a tax we pay." And California Governor Gavin Newsom posted, quote, "What the actual F are we doing?"
But at the same time, the sources show a completely different narrative forming on the right. U.S. Republican Bernie Moreno actually praised the tariffs, claiming that Canada's economy, quote, only exists by stealing American jobs.
It's just such a stark contrast.
It is. And even within Canada, conservative MPs like Leanne Rood and Tim Houston are fiercely criticizing Carney, Rood argued that after 18 months of Carney's leadership, Canada is so weak that just walking away and matching tariffs is the only victory they can even claim.
Meanwhile, The Telegraph published an analysis suggesting that Carney is essentially writing a template for resistance that European leaders are studying right now because they're anticipating that they might be the next target for U.S. tariffs.
Right, they're watching this playbook unfold.
But I have to stop here and just challenge the underlying logic of this entire trade strategy. Because it's like tearing out the load-bearing beams of your house because you don't like the carpenter, but doing it before you've even bought the wood to build a replacement.
That's a great way to put it.
Right. You aren't protecting the house, you're just collapsing the roof on your own head. If tariffs are theoretically designed to protect American businesses from foreign competition, why are American business advocates and local politicians the ones screaming the loudest right now?
Well, it's because the theory of a tariff completely ignores the reality of modern supply chain mechanics. The idea is to make foreign goods more expensive, so domestic goods become more competitive, right?
Yeah.
But that assumes you have a domestic supply chain sitting idle, ready to instantly replace those foreign goods. And you don't.
Right. You can't just flip a switch.
Exactly. When the U.S. abruptly slaps a 50% tariff on electrical equipment or lumber, local businesses who rely on those materials cannot just retool the domestic factory overnight. Supply chains are locked into multi-year contracts.
So what happens to those local businesses?
So those American businesses have to pay the 50% markup to Canada because they literally have no other choice if they want to keep their doors open. That raises their operating costs immediately, which they then pass on to you at the cash register.
Wow.
Yeah. The protective shield of a tariff acts as a self-inflicted tax on domestic businesses in the short term.
But here's the terrifying thing about inflation. It doesn't stay confined to the border. The exact same dynamic of shrinking supply driving up costs is happening right in the middle of the country.
Yeah, and this one hits even closer to home.
It really does. Only this time, it's not lumber or electrical equipment. It's the food on your table. Senator Elizabeth Warren posted a stark list in our sources, pointing out that the cost of housing, utilities, healthcare, gas, and groceries are all going, quote, up, up, up.
And people are feeling that every single day.
Absolutely. So to combat this, the administration just announced a major executive decision to import 300,000 metric tons of foreign beef into the United States, specifically to lower the price of ground beef.
And just like the tariffs, this executive action has triggered massive bipartisan backlash from politicians representing agricultural states.
Right. You've got lawmakers like Democrat Henry Kohler in Texas and Republicans Zach Nunn in Iowa, Roger Marshall and Jerry Moran in Kansas, and Kat Kamak in Florida, all pushing back fiercely on this.
Yeah, they are furious.
But wait, hang on. If grocery prices are soaring because we don't have enough domestic supply, importing beef sounds like an obvious logical fix for the consumer, right? Why are lawmakers from agricultural states furious about getting help to lower prices?
To understand their anger, you have to look at the actual economic mechanics of raising cattle. A herd of cattle isn't an assembly line you can just, turn on and off. The U.S. is currently experiencing the smallest cattle herd in a lifetime.
A lifetime.
A lifetime. Senator Moran pointed out that this is the result of years of severe economic forces and natural disasters, like these prolonged droughts, that forced ranchers to cull their herds just to survive.
Ah, okay. Dr. Roger Marshall noted in the sources that we aren't short on other protein options like chicken or pork. What's missing is the economic signal to U.S. ranchers to actually grow their cattle herds back.
Yes. And that takes years.
Yeah.
A rancher needs high market prices today to justify the massive expense of holding back female cows for breeding rather than just sending them to slaughter.
Okay, that makes sense.
Right. So when the government decides to flood the market with 300,000 tons of cheap, subsidized foreign beef, they artificially depress the market price. They completely wipe out that economic signal.
So it's essentially eating the seed corn. It's like putting a cheap Band-Aid on a broken leg. I mean, doesn't this risk creating a long-term disaster if American cattle farms go out of business tomorrow?
Exactly. If you artificially drop the price of beef today with a flood of imports, the domestic rancher, whose operating costs are still sky high, starts operating at a loss.
And they can't sustain that.
No. If they operate at a loss, they can't afford to rebuild their herd. They might even have to sell off more of their remaining cows or sell their land entirely just to pay the mortgage.
Wow. So where does that leave us in the future?
Well, 5 years from now, your domestic beef supply is even smaller than it is today. You are now structurally dependent on foreign beef, which leaves the country incredibly vulnerable to global price shocks. It is a short-term political fix for consumer inflation that causes long-term structural damage to national food security.
And the sources highlight a deeply uncomfortable contrast here, too. While agricultural stake representatives are warning of an existential crisis for ranchers, Secretary of Agriculture Brooke Rollins was out at the Iowa State Fair, enthusiastically promoting a, quote, USDA data modernization listening session.
Yeah, the optics on that are pretty jarring.
Right. The disconnect between bureaucratic data initiatives and the urgent collapse of domestic herds on the ground is just, it's wild.
It really highlights a government trying to manage symptoms rather than address the underlying disease.
Which forces us to look past consumer goods and agriculture and examine the macroeconomic foundation that's funding all of this. We need to talk about the bond market and the national debt, because that is where the real systemic risk lies.
It is the bedrock of the whole system.
Exactly. I want to go back to that math from Senator Rick Scott that we opened with. The national debt just crossed $40 trillion. And because of the sheer size of the debt and current interest rates, the U.S. is paying $3 billion a day just in interest.
To put that in perspective for you listening, when the government has to find $3 billion every single day just to tread water on its interest payments, it has to aggressively sell Treasury bonds to investors.
Which has a ripple effect.
Right, a massive one. That sucks an enormous amount of available cash out of the global financial system. When the government absorbs all that cash, there is less money available for private lending, which is a major reason why the interest rate on your credit card and your car loan remains stuck at a painful high.
Right. And of course, the partisan blame game over how we actually got here is in full swing. House Minority Leader Hakeem Jeffries pointed the finger squarely at the Republican majority, citing what critics call the One Big Ugly Bill, which supporters, of course, call the One Big Beautiful Bill.
Naturally.
Yeah. According to the community notes and the sources, this legislation raised the statutory debt limit by $5 trillion and is projected to increase deficits by $3.4 trillion over 10 years. Jeffries also blamed the costs of what he termed a reckless war of choice in Iran.
Regardless of who is to blame, though, the Treasury Department is the entity left to actually manage this crisis. Because the debt supply is so massive, investors demand higher yields, meaning higher interest rates, to absorb the risk of buying it.
Right, they want to be compensated for the risk.
Exactly. So Treasury Secretary Scott Bessent has taken a newly activist role to stop those yields from rising. He has been actively conducting debt buybacks.
Okay, I need you to break down the mechanics here because debt buybacks sounds like impenetrable Wall Street jargon to me. How does the government buying its own debt magically lower a bond yield?
Okay, think of a Treasury bond like an IOU that the government sells to an investor.
Okay, an IOU. Got it.
When the government issues too many IOUs, the market gets flooded. To entice buyers to take on all that paper, the government has to offer a higher interest rate or yield on those IOUs.
With supply and demand.
Exactly. What Secretary Bessent is doing is stepping into the open market and buying back older IOUs that the government previously issued. By buying them back, he reduces the overall supply of bonds floating around in the market.
Oh, I see. So there are fewer of them out there.
Right. When supply drops, the price of the remaining bonds naturally goes up. And in finance, bond prices and bond yields operate on a strict seesaw mechanism. When the price goes up, the yield mathematically has to go down. He's basically creating artificial demand to force interest rates lower.
And it briefly worked, right. The sources show that long-dated yields plunged on Wednesday when the news of the buybacks first broke.
They plunged, yes, but they immediately rebounded the next day.
Oof.
Yeah, and the broader financial community is sounding the alarm about this tactic. Publications like Fortune, MarketWatch, and the Wall Street Journal are warning that Bessent's actions are actively undercutting the Federal Reserve Chair, Kevin Warsh, who traditionally manages interest rates.
Wow, so there's an internal conflict there.
Very much so. Fortune even noted that a top economist warned this puts the U.S. on a path similar to Japan's stagnant economy, risking the literal, quote, debasement of the U.S. dollar.
Okay, here's where it gets really interesting, because just when you think the financial maneuvering couldn't get more complex, it takes a turn into the surreal.
It really does.
While the Treasury is attempting these highly technical buybacks, President Trump was speaking to reporters at Joint Base Andrews, and he suggested a completely different tactic.
And this is the part that shook the markets.
Yes. He threatened that the U.S. military could be utilized for further intervention to lower U.S. Treasury yields. He called it the, quote, ultimate intervention, saying if we have to use that, we will.
The introduction of military force into a conversation about sovereign bond yields, is, I mean, it's entirely outside the bounds of traditional modern finance.
Yeah, I am struggling to even visualize how this would work. It feels like trying to fix a leaky faucet with a sledgehammer. Let's critically think about this. How does a tank or a troop deployment lower a bond yield?
It doesn't. Sovereign debt markets operate entirely on psychological confidence, economic data, and trust in the rule of law.
It's like trying to negotiate a lower mortgage rate by pointing a tank at the bank teller, right? You don't change the mathematical risk of the loan, you just force the bank to board up its windows and stop lending entirely. How does the global financial market even process a threat like that?
It processes it as a catastrophic degradation of trust. You cannot coerce a global investor in, say, Tokyo or London to buy a U.S. Treasury bond at a lower yield by threatening them with military force. It's
Yeah.
impossible.
Right, they just won't buy it.
Exactly. But what a statement like that does is inject massive psychological uncertainty into the global market. It signals to institutional investors that the executive branch views bond yields not as a mathematical financial metric, but as a national security issue that they are willing to address with asymmetric power.
Which has the exact opposite effect of what they want.
Precisely. When investors feel that the traditional rules of the free market might be suspended by executive fiat, they don't lower their yields. They demand even higher yields to compensate for the sudden, unpredictable sovereign risk, or they just dump U.S. assets altogether.
If the executive branch is willing to suggest suspending the normal rules of the financial market, it begs the question of where else they're willing to suspend the rules. Which brings us to a major upheaval happening within the military's own press apparatus.
Yeah, because at the same time, the military is being mentioned in the context of bond yields. The Pentagon is exerting intense pressure on information control regarding its ongoing operations.
According to CNN and Stars and Stripes itself, the Pentagon just fired the editor-in-chief of Stars and Stripes, Eric Slavin, along with their retiring publisher and a civilian reporter covering the Middle East.
Which is a huge deal for a military publication.
Huge. Slavin went on camera and stated he was fired for insubordination, specifically because he refused to accept censorship regarding coverage of the ongoing war in Iran.
And Slavin cited Department of Defense regulations and federal law to back himself up. Those laws explicitly state that Stars and Stripes must be protected from news management and censorship.
Right, because it's not supposed to be propaganda.
Exactly. The publication exists to provide unbiased, independent news to deployed service members, not to act as a public relations arm for the Pentagon.
And Representative Ruben Gallego, who is a military veteran himself, pointed out that troops actively deployed in conflicts like the war in Iran rely on this independent reporting. He called firing journalists for standing by the First Amendment a slap in the face to the men and women putting their lives on the line.
When you zoom out and look at all of this together, the trade wars, the agricultural interventions, the massive debt, the military censorship, you see a political landscape that is beginning to fracture under the weight of these executive actions.
Yeah. Senator Elizabeth Warren made the argument that despite all these rising costs and what she called corruption and slimy tax deals, the GOP majority in Congress refuses to constrain the executive branch.
But the sources also show that the pressure isn't just coming from the left anymore.
Not at all. There are deep cracks forming within the MAGA movement itself right now. Forbes reported that Representative Marjorie Taylor Greene recently called Trump a, quote, Trojan horse, which signals a massive internal rift.
And this fracturing is affecting the basic day-to-day machinery of government, too.
Yes, we have a source showing Republican Senator Kevin Cramer from North Dakota actively holding up one of the president's judicial nominees, Phil Axe.
Over something completely unrelated, right?
Completely unrelated. Axe is apparently highly qualified, a former Solicitor General, but Cramer is refusing to vote for him until a different issue is resolved. He's demanding the U.S. Fish and Wildlife Service fix a Biden-era rule that allows North Dakota farmers' land to be flooded without compensation.
So you are basically watching the legislative branch seize up. When the executive branch attempts to override complex systems by fiat, lawmakers resort to extreme obstructionism on unrelated issues just to exert whatever leverage they still have left.
You've got economic pressure with tariffs, financial pressure in the bond market, and now information pressure with military censorship all building up simultaneously. It's like watching a massive structural stress test on a skyscraper where all these structural beams are taking immense unnatural weight at the exact same time.
That's exactly what it feels like.
Right. What happens to the building when the structural limits of the material are finally reached?
Well, when the structural limits are reached, the system either vents the stress through massive fundamental reform or it catastrophically fractures. What we are seeing in this stack of sources from August 21 and 22 is an administration trying to command the global economy through sheer force rather than steering it through careful policy.
So for you listening right now, taking all this in can feel completely overwhelming. But understanding the mechanical connections between these events is your ultimate armor against information overload.
It really is.
Knowing that a collapsed trade deal with Canada dictates the price of your groceries in Minnesota, or understanding that the Treasury's desperate mathematical attempts to lower bond yields will ultimately dictate the mortgage rate you can get on a house, that knowledge is power. It connects abstract geopolitical headlines directly to your daily reality.
Because recognizing the underlying patterns of how policy physically alters the economy allows you to anticipate structural changes rather than simply reacting to the pain of them when they finally hit.
Which leaves us with one final, provocative thought to mull over today. We saw the Telegraph note that Canada's Prime Minister Mark Carney is creating a template of resistance for European leaders.
Right, they're watching and learning.
So if the United States continues to aggressively weaponize tariffs against its closest allies and simultaneously threatens to use military intervention in its own bond markets to manipulate yields, are we witnessing the beginning of a permanently decentralized global economy? What happens to the supremacy of the US dollar and our entire domestic way of life if the rest of the world simply decides the chaos is too much and they quietly build a new financial ecosystem without us?
I mean, that is the ultimate consequence of breaking the trust that holds the global market together.
It's definitely something to keep in mind the next time you see a headline about a seemingly isolated political maneuver. Thanks for joining us on this deep dive. Stay curious.